Boring Greek myths for sleep. Why Narcissus ignored invitations to every party story. 1. Beautiful for his own good. 1,500 to 2,000 words. You are lying still now. Perhaps, why boring? Greek myths for sleep. Why Narcissus ignored invitations to every part. Your eyes are already a little heavy. And while the world outside moves faster and faster, let us slow everything down to the pace of old stories and colder. Stone paths where sandals scuffed marble and water carried whispers. Our story begins in the forests of Boeotia, a central region of ancient Greece, known less for its monuments and more for its quiet valleys and still lakes. In a world full of gods who turned into swans and storms, and humans who insisted on looking them in the eye anyway. It was common for strange births to be noted and whispered about. Narcissus, son of the river god Cephissus and the nymph Liriope, was one such birth. Even as a child, he was said to glow, not in any divine way. His was the glow of near perfection, not the flaming fire of Olympus. The nymphs gossiped about him behind birch trees. Farmers paused mid-harvest to simply observe him walking by. His curls were dark as olive bark, and his eyes a shade of blue rarely seen except in deepest pools. His features were so balanced, so precise, that even those not given to admiration found themselves quietly unsettled in his presence. And this is where things get strange, not because he did something, but because he didn't. Narcissus didn't revel in attention. He didn't giggle or bask in praise. He accepted admiration the way one accepts the weather. People complimented him, offered wreaths or even poems, but he, strangely, preferred solitude. He didn't want to go to the summer feasts. He politely turned down invitations to temple dedications, games, or the soft bonfires where other young people met and sang. He rarely looked anyone in the eye for long, and yet it wasn't shyness, not exactly. It was as though he was ... waiting. There is no great moment in Narcissus' youth that explains him away. No tragic humiliation at a festival, no betrayal by a close friend, no prophetic thunder from above. Just a boy born from still waters who seemed always too long for quiet. He was particularly fond of still pools, not the bustling riverbanks or crashing coasts, but those tucked away spring-fed ponds surrounded by reeds and willow. He would sit by them for hours, sketching shapes in the dust with a reed, or tossing stones to count the ripples. One might wonder, what did he think about? Was he vain, mulling over his beauty? Or was he simply free of interest in the world around him, as if the everyday affairs of mortals were too noisy? The truth is more mundane and perhaps more tragic. Narcissus was content with being alone. now. This was deeply frustrating to others. There was, for instance, a Menasa young man from a nearby village who became enamored with Narcissus. He left tokens of affection at the boy's favorite path, waited under fig trees for hours, and even tried to write poetry, though his verses were more hopeful than skilled. Narcissus did not mock him. He did not lead him on, but he also did not accept him. Narcissus told him plainly, "I do not love you." Amanias, heartbroken and humiliated, would not take the message. He returned one last time, desperate for something more than silence. Narcissus, perhaps out of pity or discomfort, handed him a sword and told him to leave him alone. Later that day, Amanias took his life on Narcissus's doorstep, calling out to the gods to curse the one who could not love another. This is where some say the curse began, though others claim it started earlier, later. As with most Greek myths, the timeline is less a series of firm events and more like shadows cast by firelight. Interpretations flicker, but still the story presses on, and Narcissus retreats deeper. He continues to walk alone. Even the gods begin to take notice, but not out of admiration. Aphrodite, goddess of love and vanity, is said to have been especially annoyed. A beautiful mortal who refuses love, who wastes his gifts in solitude, who turns down affection without cruelty, yet without warmth. This was not how the world was meant to work. But why did Narcissus keep saying no? Why did he turn down every dance, every song, every carefully packed Figan honey picnic? Was it arrogance? A deep and aching pride? Or something even more obscure? Was Narcissus afraid of the very thing others sought from him? Perhaps he feared becoming known. For to be truly known by another is, in many ways, to lose the quiet shelter of one's own mind. Or perhaps he had already met the only person he wished to be close to himself, and maybe that is in vanity. Maybe in a world of chaos, he found peace in the only person who made sense to him. And so, the boy who never danced became a kind of rumor. The one who declined everything. The one who preferred pawns to people. The one who seemed to mourn something unnamed. Even as he walked the fields with perfect posture and unbothered grace. But silence can echo, and even Narcissus, for all his stillness, would eventually find that he had become his own trap. Section 2. Echoes in the forest and the curse that followed. 1,500 to 2,000 words so far. We've seen Narcissus as a boy, set apart, not boastful, but quiet, distant, and devoted to solitude. A young man who walked through the world as if he belonged more to still water than to human company. His choices, refusals, his near-ascetic, come-invited admiration, longing, and eventually resentment. But stories, especially Greek ones, do not leave such figures alone forever. This brings us to Echo. Now. Echo was not a mere mortal. She was a mountain nymph fan, or yet known for her voice. Not her singing, exactly, but her speech. Echo loved to talk, and she loved to listen. She could imitate any tone, any phrase, any pattern of speech with perfect fluency. She was, in a way, the gossip of the gods, but not malicious, really, ever curious. Her voice was her gift and her downfall. You see, once, when Zeus was off wandering, doing the sorts of things Zeus always, Didaco, was employed in the time-honored tradition of distracting Hera, his endlessly suspicious wife. With story after story, Echo drew Hera away from the truth, using her endless voice like a net of distraction. But Hera, clever and spiteful, eventually realized what was happening, and when she did, she cursed Echo with silence, but with repetition. She stripped Echo of her ability to form original speech. From then on, Echo could only repeat the last words spoken to her. It was not silence, but a hollow imitation. Banished, cursed, and heartbroken, Echo wandered the woods. There, one day, she saw Narcissus. Some say it was the way. He bent to sip from a stream. Others say it was the way he sat so quietly among the trees, as if he were made from them. But however it happened, Echo fell deeply and instantly in love. Now imagine, if you will, being filled with words you cannot say, desperate to speak, but bound to echo only what you hear. She followed Narcissus for days. Not stealthily, she was too enchanted for that. She crept behind him like a reflection, repeating fragments of his own speech, half hoping he'd turn and speak directly to her. Finally, one afternoon, Narcissus paused in a small clearing and muttered aloud, "Is anyone here?" From behind a tree, Echo whispered, "Here." He looked around. "Come closer, closer," she replied. He frowned. "Why do you hide?" "A stranger repeating your words, eyes wide with longing." To Narcissus, who had avoided connection his entire life, this was not poetic, it was disturbing. And so, he did what he always did. He rejected her, but unlike others, Echo could not explain herself, could not plead or reason. Her curse made her doomed to confusion. She fled, mortified and heartbroken. And in some tellings, she withered into nothing but her voice haunting valleys and caves, forever repeating words that were never hers. Another soul wounded by Narcissus. And yet, was it truly cruelty, or simply his refusal to offer what he didn't feel, but the gods are rarely interested in nuance. And so, the curse that would define Narcissus finally took shape. Nemesis. The goddess of retribution balance. Some say decided that enough was enough. A mortal so beautiful, yet incapable of love. A boy who wounded hearts without lifting a finger. She devised the punishment not of fire or pain, or monsters, but of irony. One day, while walking alone, Narcissus came upon a new spring in the woods. The air was still, the water clearer than anything he'd ever seen. And as he bent to drink, he saw something, a face. It was not a vague reflection. It was, to him, a being, a soul, someone leaning forward, eyes meeting his, lips parted in the same soft breath. Someone who looked exactly like him, but whom he did not recognize. He was mesmerized, sat by the edge for hours, days. Some say he whispered to the reflection, and it whispered back. He smiled and was smiled at, tilted his head, and the being did the same. Perfect synchronicity. It was not vanity, at least not in the modern sense. Narcissus didn't say, "I am beautiful." He said, "This person is beautiful. This person sees me. They understand." He did not realize he was falling in love with himself, only that he was, at last, captivated, open, vulnerable. He reached for the figure. The surface trembled. The image broke. He panicked. The water calmed. The figure returned, and on it went. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping. He remained there, transfixed. Some say he tried to kiss the water, others that he simply wept beside it. In every version, he pined Dot, and slowly he withered. This is where the curse completes itself. Narcissus, who rejected all love, finally felt it only for someone he could never truly reach. He discovered intimacy only to be doomed to lose it every time he touched it. And yet, there's a quiet dignity to the tale. Narcissus harmed no one directly. He never promised love, never led anyone astray. His curse was to be finally understood by someone who could never exist. But there's something else here to a question that myth rarely answers. Did Narcissus know? Did he ever realize the face in the water was his own? Some versions suggest he did that. With dawning horror, he understood and could not look away. Others say he never figured it out, always believing he'd found his long-lost twin flame. Either way, he stayed, and eventually he faded where he died. A flower bloomed, delicate white petals, a soft golden center. The Narcissus flower, named for a boy who only ever loved once, and even then. Perhaps too late. But what if it wasn't just a curse? What if the story is not about vanity or punishment, but about longing. The kind of longing that has no object. A quiet ache that doesn't ask for drama. Just understanding. And what if the face Narcissus loved was not his own, but the only person who had ever looked back at him? Section 3. The stillness after the surface breaks 1,500 to 2,000 words. We return, as we so often do in these old tales, to the edge of a still pool. Narcissus is there. Or rather, he was. The stories disagree on how long he stayed by the water, but they all agree that time lost its meaning. Days may have passed, or weeks. The reeds grew. The light shifted. Birds came and went. And still, Narcissus remained, watching. Now and then, he reached out. The water rippled. The face was gone. He waited. The face returned. And so, he learned not to move too quickly. He adjusted the rhythm of his life to the stillness of the spring. He grew thin, pale. A boy who had walked through the world untouchable was now entirely rooted to one place. Some say that villagers found him, that they tried to coax him away. But how do you speak sense to someone who believes they've finally found the person who understands them? Others say that Echo watched from afar, that she lingered in the trees, powerless to help, still repeating the last words he said: "Stay, please, you're beautiful." Or, if he did, he mistook it for the voice of the water. As Narcissus's body faded, his story began to grow. Nymphs told it to one another in low voices, not out of ridicule, but as a sort of mourning. His beauty had been his burden, his solitude, his only comfort, and in the end, it was his undoing. But not just undoing. Something else happened to Dot where his body had once lain. A flower bloomed, not a grand flower, not a rose or a peony. The Narcissus was a modest, bloom-slender stem, soft petals, often bent gently forward, as if peering into its own shadow. It grows near water. It reflects. It waits. This flower, named after Narcissus, became more than a memorial. It became a symbol, not of vanity, but of introspection, of what happens when we fold too tightly into ourselves, of the fine line between solitude and isolation. But let us not leave too quickly. Let's linger here a little longer, the water's edge. There's something quiet to be learned from Narcissus. Many versions of his story try to teach a lesson about self-love turned toxic, about vanity or hubris. But these versions feel too loud, too tidy. They miss something deeper, something slower. Consider this: Narcissus did not harm others through malice. He simply did not feel what they felt, and he could not pretend to. He did not chase glory, nor seek praise. He avoided crowds praise and gifts. In a world full of noise, he sought silence, and, in the end, he found a version of it, the ultimate stillness. But even then, the stillness was not enough. Because still water only reflects it, does not embrace. Perhaps this story has less to say about beauty and more about connection. About how even the most self-contained souls may one day long for recognition. Not from admirers, but from equals. From someone who doesn't want something from them just to understand. That is, in the end, what Narcissus seems to have wanted. Not worship, not praise. Just someone who looked back at him with the same stillness, someone who saw him fully and stayed. Of course, myths don't give us clean resolutions. Echo remains a voice without a body. Narcissus becomes a flower. The gods remain as they always were, distant, bemused, reactive, but the story lingers. It has lasted longer than empires. It has been retold in art, poetry, philosophy, and in every version, the same image returns. A beautiful boy staring into water, slowly fading, and yet, somehow, it doesn't feel tragic. Not entirely, because in that fading, something grew. A flower, a symbol, a reminder that even in the quietest corners of the world, something endures. And maybe, just maybe, the story of Narcissus isn't about what was lost, but what remains. A question left behind, like a ripple that never quite reaches the shore. What do we see when we finally see ourselves? Story 2, Swift Feet and Slippery Lies. The young god Hermes, Section 1, the baby who stole cattle before he could walk 1,500 to 2,000 words. Let us begin again slowly, gently returning to the sun-drenched hillsides of ancient Arcadia. The olives are ripening. The shepherds are half asleep under shade trees, and somewhere far from Olympus and its thunderous disputes, a cave quietly echoes with the first cries of a newborn god. Hermes was born at dawn. The son of Maia, quiet, reclusive, nymphand. Zeus, who was, as ever, wandering. Maia, gentle and secretive, lived in a secluded cave on Mount Selene. She wanted nothing more than peace and silence. But her son had other plans. Within hours of his birth, Hermes had wriggled free of his swaddling cloth and toddled out of the cave. His little legs were absurdly quick for a baby. He didn't walk, he zipped. There was no stumbling, no hesitation. It was as if he had always been in motion now. Most infants would spend their first day blinking at light, perhaps tasting their fingers or clumsily waving at shadows. Not Hermes. He decided to invent theft. What he stole was no small thing. He stole Apollo's cattle. Now, you might think this an odd choice for a first crime after all. Apollo was not just any god. He was radiant, precise, proud, and very protective of his sacred animals. But Hermes didn't steal out of malice. He stole out of curiosity, mischief, a desire to test the boundaries of divinity. He planned it. He didn't want to get caught, so he crept down from the mountain and found the herd. Then, thinking like a trickster, even in his earliest moments, he did something clever. He made the cows walk backward. He tied reeds to their tails and herded them in reverse, so their hoof prints pointed the wrong way. Then he wore sandals made of woven bark and leaves to hide his own prints. Though, of course, the idea of footwear this early in life raises some questions. Still, the stories insist Hermes may well have invented shoes that very day. And just like that, a baby stole sacred cattle and got away with it at least for a while. When Apollo noticed his cattle were gone, he was furious. You must understand, Apollo's fury was not the thunder of Zeus. It was the cold fury of a being who expected order, a sun god whose every moment was symmetrical, predictable. Clean dot, so when Apollo traced the hoofprints and found they pointed away from the true path, he became suspicious. Eventually, the clues led him to the cave on Mount Selene. There he found Hermes lying innocently in his cradle, wrapped up like the world's most unbothered infant. Hermes yawned, Apollo glared. The confrontation, ... Bizarre. Apollo demanded the return of his cattle. Hermes, blinking with wide baby eyes, said he had no idea what the older god was talking about. He cooed. He sneezed. He babbled incoherently. Apollo, baffled and increasingly furious, dragged the baby, the literal baby, up to Olympus to be judged. Now imagine Zeus, father to them both, watching this strange procession arrive. Golden Apollo, polished and fuming, holding a squirming, giggling infant accused of cattle theft. And here we find ourselves in one of the more absurd scenes in all of Greek mythology. Zeus listened to Apollo's complaint. Hermes, somehow managing to speak despite his age, argued his case with flair. He claimed innocence. He claimed confusion. He pointed out, quite reasonably, that he was only a day old. But Zeus, who knew trickery, when he saw it, began to smile. He liked this one. He saw something of himself, though. Truthfully, Hermes was even slip, P-E-R-I-E-R. Eventually, Hermes admitted to the theft. But before Apollo could erupt again, Hermes did something brilliant. He offered a gift. He pulled out a newly crafted instrumental lyre made from a tortoise shell. with strings of stretched cow gutton, strummed it. Apollo, god of music, paused. The sound was delicate, plucked and golden. Nothing like the formal harp tones of Olympus. This was something ... new ... And just like that, Hermes brokered a peace. He gave the lyre to Apollo, who was so delighted that he forgave the cattle incident. In the span of one day, Hermes was born, invented sandals, tricked a god, stole sacred animals, created the lyre, and walked away without punishment. A busy day for anyone, especially an infant. But this was only the beginning. What followed was a life not of grand conquest or world-changing prophecy, but of endless errands, whispered secrets, practical jokes, and brilliantly designed escape routes. Hermes, in time, would become the god of travelers, messengers, merchants, thieves, and perhaps most of all clever thinking. But why exactly did Hermes invent those shoes? Was it just to hide his tracks? Or was there something deeper, need to always be on the move? To never leave behind a clear path? To make the world just uncertain enough that even the gods had to think twice? And if you were born into a world of power and expectation, wouldn't you want to run free too? Section 2. The first courier of the gods, 1,500 to 2,000 words so far. Hermes has slipped into our story like a breeze, through an open window, quiet, unexpected, and unsettling only in hindsight. Born at dawn, thief by noon, musician by dusk, and a diplomat before the moon had arisen, he was unlike any other god. And yet, despite the mischief and rule-bending, Hermes did something rare among Olympians. He made himself useful. You see, while the rest of the gods bickered and postured, Zeus hurling thunder, Poseidon grumbling from the sea, Hera stewing with suspicion, Hermes moved. He ran errands, he fetched items, he delivered messages. He took secrets from one corner of the cosmos to another. And soon, the other gods began to notice something strange. They liked having him around. But let's pause here and return to the sandals. Because while many remember Hermes as the god with winged shoes, few pause to consider why that matters. Shoes were a symbol of the earth-bound, walking, of connection to terrain. In Greek art, most gods stood barefoot, grounded, timeless. But Hermes strapped things to his feet. He changed direction. He sped up. He left. It made him not just quick, but unpredictable. The first version of the Talaria, the winged sandals, were probably more metaphor than fashion. But in myth, they were practical too. With them, Hermes could travel between the mortal world, Olympus, and even the underworld. No other god could do that not without drama. But Hermes just ... slipped through. And that's where things get interesting. Because Hermes didn't stop at carrying messages. He became the psychopompa, soft, almost sleepy word that means soul guide. Wandered, confused and heavy with memory. Most feared the journey, but Hermes appeared, light-footed and calm. He didn't demand anything. He simply led the way, down the misty paths toward the river Styx. Imagine that being escorted to the afterlife, not by a grim reaper, but by a mischievous, talkative god who once stole cows and invented music. There was comfort in it, a sense of movement, that even in death you were not alone. But his usefulness didn't stop there. When Zeus needed someone to carry a secret message to a king, Hermes, when Aphrodite wanted a love letter delivered with charm and subtlety, Hermes, when Hades needed someone discreet to arrange an unusual marriage proposal to Persephone, Hermes, again, he became the quiet machinery of Olympus, making things work without taking the credit. While others demanded altars, temples, and grand ceremonies of battle, and then vanished before anyone noticed. And still, he kept adding to his skill set. He invented more things, to the caduceus, carols, staff-topped with wings and winding serpents, not for power, but for signaling peace and negotiation. He designed weights and measures, invented trait systems, and offered clever ideas to mortals without taking much credit. If there was ever a god for bureaucratic miracles, the forgotten art of making things work was Hermes. But even a messenger, God had his limits, or rather, he learned to manage them, because as time passed, Hermes did not grow bored, but he did grow tired of being underestimated. He began to weave his errands with trickery. He delivered things with double meanings. Letters that said one thing and implied another. Gifts that were helpful but had consequences. He played both sides, but never with cruelty. More like someone who enjoyed the dance of diplomacy, the quiet tension of saying just enough and no more. He also, despite his boyish charm, rarely stayed in one place long enough to build many lasting relationships. And children, this was Olympus, after all, but no grand romances, no tragedies, just encounters quick, clever, and soon over. The winged sandals, it turns out, were not just a tool. They were a way of life. He had to keep moving, not to escape. Exactly, but because, and the only thing Hermes feared, perhaps, was being cornered. Define ... to name Hermes too precisely is to misunderstand him. He wasn't the god of trickery, or messengers, or travel, or trade. He was all of those things and none. He moved between categories, between boundaries, even his birth half divine. Nymph placed him in the middle of everything, and so he ran through fields, under stars, across oceans, into the minds of men, asleep and dreaming. If a king received an unexpected vision, Hermes, if a soldier felt a strange calm before battle, Hermes, if a thief found the perfect moment to slip through a crowd, Hermes, perhaps, looking on with quiet pride. But behind all that movement, one wonders, did Hermes ever want to stop? Did he long, even for a moment, to simply sit, to take off the sandals, stretch his feet, and hear nothing but the sound of birds? Or was stillness something he feared, because in stillness you can be seen? And for a god born in motion, maybe that was the one thing he could never bear. Section 3 of Silence, Souls, and the Roads Between Worlds, 1,500 to 2,000 words. The trouble with being fast is that no one ever sees you stop. And yet, even Hermes, god of motion, messenger of the skies, must have paused, if only for a moment, perhaps by a roadstone or beneath the thin shade of an olive tree, sandals dangling from his shoulder. But no myth ever mentions it. The stories only show him mid-stride. We've seen him grow from a precocious infant who stole cattle and invented shoes in the same breath, into a god who stitched the cosmos together with nothing but quiet errands and unread scrolls. Yet, through it all, there remains one curious truth. Hermes belonged nowhere. He visited Olympus, but he wasn't revered like Apollo or feared like Ares. He dipped into the mortal world, but didn't stay. He entered the underworld, but did not dwell, even. Among the gods, Hermes was the in-between. He was the divine postman. Yes, but he was also the god of boundaries. Not the kind marked by walls or signs, but subtler ones. The space between dusk and night, between breath and silence, between decision and action. He governed liminality, that fuzzy, in-between space, where things are not quite one thing or another. You may pass a threshold without noticing, but Hermes lives there, and so he watched. He watched mortals make bargains and break them, watched gods lose arguments to mortals with clever tongues, watched traders swap coin and olive oil in dusty markets, and souls wander quietly across the river Styx. He did not judge. He merely facilitated, and this gave him a kind of wisdom not born of solitude, like Athena's, nor of suffering, like Dionysus. Hermes' wisdom came from exposure, from hearing every side, carrying every message, and witnessing the lies we tell others. And ourselves now, one might expect a god with that much knowledge to become bitter, but Hermes never did. He remained light, quick, a god who carried sorrow as easily as he carried a feather, but never let it weigh him down. Still, the myths hint at something more beneath the smile. There's a story rarely told when Hermes delivered a message to a dying poet. The man, half conscious, asked him, "Will my words be remembered?" Hermes knelt beside him and said, softly, "Some will, some won't, but someone will speak your name again." It's not a grand prophecy, but it's the kind of answer only Hermes would give, truthful but gentle. Not a promise, just a possibility. And perhaps that's what made Hermes beloved, not just to the gods, but to travelers, merchants, thieves, poets, and messengers alike. He didn't demand worship. He didn't insist on greatness. He simply offered a path forward. He understood that sometimes all you need is someone to walk with you a little while between one chapter of life and the next. Even his inventions reflected this. Caduceus, often mistaken for a symbol of medicine, was a staff of peace held by negotiators, those who moved between warring sides to offer terms, not weapons. Two serpents twined around it, not fighting, but balanced. Harmony through conversation, stillness through movement. He also created the Pedicasa wide-brimmed travel hat, unremarkable, yet endlessly practical. Hermes was not flashy. His miracles were modest, a well-timed arrival, a missed patrol, a coin found at just the right moment in time. Humans began to leave offerings to him at Herm's stone markers placed along roads. Small piles of stones, sometimes engraved, sometimes not. Travelers would pause, touch the stone, maybe add a pebble, not to ask for miracles, just to say, "I'm still moving." Because that, in the end, was Hermes' quiet gospel. Keep moving, even slowly, even when the road is unclear. Especially then, we often imagine gods as static thrones, lightning bolts, temples. But Hermes never stayed still long enough to be carved in stone. And so he lives on, not in temples, but in transitions. In the moment you leave one job and haven't yet started the next dot in the quiet stretch between question and answer, in the miles between home and somewhere. New dot and yesivin in the rustle of your own shoes when you walk alone, uncertain where you're headed, but choosing to walk anyway. If Narcissus taught us about reflection, Hermes teaches us about motion. To be in between is not to be lost. Sometimes it is to be exactly where you're meant to be. And so, somewhere out there on a road with no name, under a sky just beginning to fade, Hermes is still walking, dot light, dash-footed, untroubled, and always a few steps ahead. Story 3: Tides and Tantrums. Poseidon, the Horse. And the Salt Fountain. Section 1. The god who wanted a city of his own. 1,500 to 2,000 words. We begin this tale not with a wave or a storm, but with something far quieter. A coastline in early morning, damp with salt spray and lit by the first pale shimmer of sunlight. Somewhere out there, in the deep blue where mortal eyes can't follow, the god Poseidon stirred. Poseidon was, by all accounts, a formidable being, brother to Zeus and Hades, ruler of the seas, earth shaker, wave bringer, mood shifter. His realm was vast, but underneath the crashing waves and divine bluster, Poseidon was, in one sense, just like any other deity on Olympus. He wanted people to like him, not fear him, not avoid him, not offer sacrifices because they were worried about sudden floods or sea serpents. He wanted proper admiration, the kind that came with a city named after you. Now, Zeus had the sky and kings and temples with golden ceilings. Athena had wisdom and crafts and a city filled with marble columns and libraries. Even Dionysus, the wine god, had entire festivals where people shouted his name while wearing ivy. Poseidon. Poseidon had the sea, which was fine, really. Sea was not ... tidy. It wasn't the kind of place where you could build monuments, and it certainly wasn't the kind of place where mortals carved your name into coins, or named their capital after you. So Poseidon, moody and ambitious, decided he wanted a city of his own. There was, at the time, a small but growing city near. The Attic, coasts, sunny, stony, and strategically located for trade. It didn't have a patron deity yet, and that meant it was up for grabs. So Poseidon arrived in a spray of salt and sea foam, trident gleaming, hair tangled with kelp. He raised his arms to the people and declared, in the booming voice of a god used to being taken seriously, "I offer myself as patron of this city. Choose me, and I will give you a gift worthy of the seas." Now, in most myths, the mortals simply nod and agree, but not this time, because someone else wanted the city too. That someone was Athena now. Athena was not one for flashy entrances or foamy declarations. She simply appeared, poised, armored, wizened, offered a counter-proposal. I too would be a worthy guardian. Choose me, and I will give you a gift born of strategy and peace. And so the competition began to decide who would become the city's divine patron. The gods agreed on a simple contest. Each would offer a single gift to the people, and the better gift would determine the winner. Poseidon went first He raised his trident, struck the rocky ground, and, with a rumble that echoed across the hills, a spring burst forth. The people gasped. Water gushed from stone. A miracle. They gathered around to taste it. And here's where things went. ... Sideways, the water was salty. Not faintly briny, oceanic, undrinkable, utterly useless for farming, bathing, or anything else one might want water for in a dry Mediterranean. City. The people exchanged awkward glances. Poseidon frowned. This is a sea spring, he said proudly. My gift, it connects you to the vastness of the ocean. A few citizens nodded politely. Then it was Athena's turn. She knelt beside the dry soil, whispered a word, and from the earth rose the first olive tree. Now, olives may not seem impressive at first glance. They're small, bitter when raw. But the Athenians were practical people. They saw the tree and thought of shade, oil, food, trade. It was useful. It was peaceful. It didn't flood anything. And so they chose Athena. Poseidon, furious, did what he usually did when displeased. He flooded a bit of the land, threw a few waves at the shore, and stormed off to sulk. But that wasn't the end of it, because Poseidon didn't just want a city. He wanted to be liked. And now, not only had he lost, he'd been rejected for a tree. A leafy, slightly dusty tree planted by a goddess in a helmet. Worse still, people started calling the place Athens, not Poseidopolis, not Tritonville, Just Athens, as if Poseidon had never even tried. This wounded him so. Naturally, he did what any self-respecting sea god would do. He tried to one-up her, but not by fighting, by inventing. And here we arrive at the stranger part of the story, because at some point, not in mythic thunder, but in an odd little aside tucked into later tellings, Poseidon tried to make a better gift, something magnificent, something beautiful, something swift, noble, and entirely new. And that gift was the horse. Yes, the horse, a creature of land, not sea. Four-legged, fast, loyal. Poseidon created it from sea foam and wind and a touch of divine irritation. He presented it proudly, as if to say, "Fine, you like practical gifts. How about this?" The horse, of course, was magnificent, but it wasn't what the city had asked for. And more importantly, it was too late. The people had chosen the olive. The horse, though admired, was just an afterthought. Still, Poseidon clung. To it, he became known not just as the god of the sea, but of horses. A strange combination, salt water and galloping hooves. But then again, Poseidon never liked to be pinned down. He may have lost the city, But he had invented something fast, powerful, noble, and somewhere on a rocky cliff above the sea. The salt spring still bubbles, monument to a god who tried and was outdone by an olive tree. But the real question lingers, unspoken in most versions of the tale. Did Poseidon invent the horse for the people, or did he invent it out of jealousy for himself? And if so, was that such a bad thing? Section 2. Galloping Pride and Jealous Fountains, 1,500 to 2,000 words. After the people of the city chose Athena and her olive tree, Poseidon did not return to the depths of the ocean in noble resignation. That's not quite how Greek gods behaved especially. Not Poseidon, who was never famous for letting things go. The spring he had gifted them, his bold, dramatic gesture maned, bubbling up between two craggy stones on the Acropolis. But nobody used it. It was too salty, too strange. The kind of water you couldn't drink, no matter how thirsty you were. Still, Poseidon wouldn't allow it to be forgotten. If mortals wouldn't drink from it, then at least they'd remember it. So he summoned storms now and then, gentle ones, mostly just. Enough rain to make the spring bubble higher, to draw attention at night. He'd whisper through the waves, telling nearby fishermen that the salt fountain on the hill had once been a divine gift. He told seabirds. He told dolphins. He even tried to tell a passing tortoise, though it took too long and the tortoise wandered off halfway through the story. But when even the dolphins lost interest, Poseidon turned back to his proudest backup creation, the horse. Now, there are multiple myths about where the horse truly came from. Some say Poseidon shaped it out of sea foam. Others claim he struck the ground with his trident again, and from that second blow, the horse emerged muscle, mane and myth fully formed. Either way, the animal was magnificent. It was fast, beautiful, a little wild around the eyes, and, importantly, it listened to him. You see, the horse was the opposite of the salt spring. It wasn't passive. It wasn't stuck in one place. It moved. It responded. It ran when Poseidon told it to, and it didn't choose Athena. Poseidon began to associate himself more and more with horses. He had them pulling his chariot over waves' chariots that didn't sink, mind you, but glided, pulled by white-maned sea stallions with hooves that left sprays of foam behind. It looked impressive, especially from a distance. He visited cities inland, showing off this strange and wonderful animal. The people were impressed. At first, they feared the horse. It was large, fast, and powerful, but over time, they learned to tame it, ride it, build carts it could pull. And Poseidon watched with pride as horses became not just showpieces, but tools of civilization, but tanned. Here's the curious thing, he still wasn't satisfied, because no one ever called those cities Pasadopoulos either. They remembered. The horses, they used them, but they didn't really thank him. Not in the way he wanted. The temples they built for Poseidon were often by the coasts, soggy, windblown, full of crabs and damp incense. Respectful, yes, but never warm. Never like the way people spoke of Athena, with her clever eyes and tidy shrines and all that graceful problem-solving. Poseidon began to resent her. It wasn't that she had won, it was how she had won. Her gift had been subtle, sustainable, quietly useful, and people remembered her for it. His gifts, loud, spectacular, wild, and they faded. The salt spring dried up in summer. The horses, after a few generations, no longer felt miraculous. They became farm animals, war animals, transport. Poseidon sulked one day, legend says. He returned to the salt fountain and struck it again with his trident, not in anger, but in frustration. This time, he didn't create another creature. He simply made the water spray higher. It burst several feet into the air, scattered like silver rain, then vanished again. When the people nearby saw it, they whispered, "He's still trying." Now, most myths leave the story there, but one old poet, long forgotten and quoted only in a few scattered lines of papyrus, added this odd little tale that Poseidon tried just once. To combine his gifts, he created a horse-shaped statue, massive, carved from sea rock and coralline, placed it near the fountain. Then he tried to make it move. He poured power into it. Whispers of tides, echoes of gallops. But the statue remained stiff. So he tried again. He shaped a new creature, a seahorse, not the small, curling ones you see floating in quiet bays, but a real blend, part horse, part sea serpent. It had hooves, but they shimmered like fish scales, a mane of algae, eyes like tide pools, and it was strange, beautiful, but unsettling. He sent it to the city. It got stuck in the mud. The people didn't know what to make of it. Some prayed to it. Others ran away. A few children tried to ride it, but were discouraged when it slithered too much. Eventually, it wandered back into the sea. Poseidon, to his credit, didn't try again. Instead, he focused on what he could control: tides, ships, sailors, fortunes, the depth and violence of the sea. He watched mortals try to read his moods by wave patterns. He listened to captains whisper prayers into the wind, and he realized something odd. While people didn't build cities in his name, they feared him, but more importantly, they respected him. They offered sacrifices before sailing. They taught their children to watch for signs in the foam. They remembered him, in poems not for clever gifts, but for power, for unpredictability, and, in time, Poseidon stopped trying to be loved, because the sea doesn't need to be loved to be known. Section 3. The sea does not need a temple 1,500 to 2,000 words. There are gods who fade and gods who change. But Poseidon, it seems, simply settled into himself. He never stopped being tempestuous. He still cracked the earth when he was annoyed. He still stirred whirlpools to remind sailors that the sea was not theirs to tame. But he stopped chasing affection, because somewhere between the gallop of horses and the sting of salt, Poseidon realized something quietly profound. The sea did not need to be adored. It needed to be respected. And Poseidon, however much he might have craved cities with his name on them, found that his true kingdom was already vast, already enduring, already full of things more mysterious than admiration. Let us return, for a moment, to that old salt spring. It still sits on the rocky hill above Athens. Even after all the centuries, the ruins of the Acropolis bear its trace. The spring no longer flows much, just a damp patch, perhaps in certain seasons. Most tourists pass it without noticing. But if you look closely, you can still see the stone depression where the water once rose, a spot where sea met land, where a god left his mark not with war or thunder, but with a confused, slightly embarrassing attempt to give the perfect gift. And in that way, it feels deeply human, because haven't we all tried to impress someone with the wrong thing? Haven't we all thought, surely they'll love this only to be met with polite silence and a quiet preference for olives? Poseidon, for all his power, was never immune to that small ache, and yet he endured. His horses ran across plains and battlefields long after temples had crumbled. His sea swelled and shrank with the moon, touching every coast. Regardless of whether people remembered his name. And in one of those strange little mythic paradoxes, the very thing that made Poseidon feel excluded, is unclaimed domain, was what made him eternal. Cities rise and fall, olive trees grow old and die, but the sea just keeps going. And that, perhaps, is Poseidon's quiet revenge, or maybe his peace, because every time a sailor looks out at the horizon and feels that mixture of wonder and dread, every time hooves strike the earth and stir up dust, every time someone mistakes control for permanence, Poseidon is there, not as a figure to be worshipped, but as a force to be reckoned with. He is the reminder that some gifts are too big to be appreciated properly, that some gods aren't meant to be chosen. They simply are. And so, the next time you stand by the sea, and the wind shifts suddenly, and the waves curl, just so you might hear him, not in words, not in thunder, but in the deep, echoing stillness of water that does not need applause, just space and depth and time.